if we're going to love God and love our neighbors, if we're going to answer Jesus' call to discipleship, to come follow me, then our everyday yes to Jesus involves walking with Jesus into and through that digital world.
This is Living Truth. Welcome to Living Truth, a media ministry of the People's Church. We share clear, gospel-centered teaching to help you grow spiritually and experience Jesus together as a global church community. We've been hearing some very inspiring and timely messages over the past few weeks throughout our series on faith and technology. Today, we'll be concluding our series with guest speaker Brad Griffin on parenting in our digital world. Here's Brad with today's message.
When you hear the term social media and digital technology, what are the first words or thoughts that come to mind for you? When we asked groups of parents this question, one mom said the first thing that came to her mind was, turn that thing off. Turn that thing off. Can you relate? Yeah, I know I can. Sometimes it feels like our kids are tethered to their phones and their devices, and we don't know why. We don't know what to do about it or how to keep that relationship in the center. So the first big question we're going to tackle, okay, is why do my kids constantly check their phones and devices? What is it that is so compelling that makes them want to constantly look down or lift that screen up to their faces? And to get our heads around this, we need to understand that we are in a whole new world. And those of us who are adults are very much immigrants to this world. Maybe it would help to think back to your own experiences as a young person, as a kid, or as a teenager. And I wonder if, like me, you can remember your first Walkman. Now, I came of age at a time when cassette tapes were popular. And when I remember the massive shift in technology innovation, when the Walkman was developed and I could take that music with me in a portable sort of way. In fact, I remember riding a school bus to a roller skating rink as a middle schooler and wearing that Walkman and listening to that music. Now, think about what we didn't expect out of that technology. We didn't expect that technology to speak back to us. We didn't expect that technology to connect us with other people or connect us with a world of ideas and images and music and interaction. And that's the difference between the analog world that we knew and the digital world that we're living in now. And that our kids, this is the only world they've ever known. And so we can't shame them for operating in the only world they've ever known. We've got to meet them there, walk with them in it. So it's important for us to think about not just how they use media or how to get them to look up at us, but why they use media the way they do, why they're so concerned about what's going on and how those screens can connect them with the world. So keep in mind, okay, first principle, they're not addicted to media necessarily, but to one another. They want to be connected to each other, in particular your teenagers. Because teenagers always need to be connected to their peers. That's the heart of what it means to be an adolescent. So we can empathize with that need because we remember that need too, okay? We remember that need. So here's another analogy to maybe help us think about that. Media scholars say that social media is like the new lunchroom. The new lunchroom. So for teenagers who are constantly wondering, who am I? They're looking around those lunchroom spaces and comparing each other. So if we go deeper under that, what's under that is connection and support. It's important to note that a recent study found that 68% of teens who are active on social media said they've received support in tough times through those channels. That social media in particular can be a stressful place, but it can also be a really important place for social support, especially for young people who feel like they're on the margins for some reason or another, or who maybe feel like they don't connect with the peers around them. And if we step back into this pandemic that we've been living through and look through those lenses, before the pandemic, we were very anxious about the kids and their devices. And during the pandemic, some of us might have said, oh, thank goodness they have their devices. Thank goodness they can connect with the world through these screens and through these platforms. And now as we're emerging to the other side of pandemic life, it raises a whole new set of questions for us. How will we be going forward? So keep in mind that connection and support are really at the heart of that, and that will help us navigate this faithfully together with our kids and among our families. Okay, next question. How can I help my family actually be together when we're in the same room? Now, I don't know how many of you are guilty of this, but maybe you've been in a situation where you've texted family members to say it's time for dinner. Even when they were in the same house, Or maybe we've struggled with sitting around in the same space, but not really being attuned to each other. Maybe it was at that dinner table where devices intervened in our communication. Maybe we were sitting around watching a movie together, but we were all on different screens. We're in the same space, but we want to stay more connected and not just be alone together. So here's another opportunity to chat in, okay? So on a scale of 1 to 5, how much tension does your family feel around digital media use? And what causes the most tension, if you're comfortable sharing that? There are so many things in our lives around this digital world that can cause tension, that can cause frustration. So if we're wanting to work with that, here's a rule of thumb to keep in mind. Not just rules, but relationships. Usually we default to rules to help us create the kinds of boundaries in our family around media in particular. And that can be really important. But it's also really important to keep relationships in mind as the end goal. When we fail to think about how and why our kids are using digital media, then our rules can kind of get in the way. Now, think about, for example, screen time and screen time limits. That's really helpful, and in particular when kids are young and when we're setting up those boundaries. But to use an example of my own son, screen time rules worked for him really well until about age 11. And then screens started to be everywhere in his life. In middle school, screens were part of his all-day experience, in particular in the pandemic. How are we going to limit screen time when that's the way he does school, he does homework, and he connects with his friends, and the way that he goes to church, right? So when screens are just omnipresent in our lives, we have to think about something else. So what is that something else? Media, people who really study media intently tell us that rituals and routine can help us. And as we make our way out of the pandemic, revisiting our rituals and routines can help us get back to life again, but back to the kind of life that we really want, not necessarily the life that we had. So we can reimagine family time, and we can look for ways technology might both help and hinder our family connection through rituals and routines. So what are those? All right. Rituals are times and places. So the where and the when and the who. Who do you use media with? And when do we use it and when do we not use it? And where in our home might we use media together? Where might we use it separately? Where is media off limits? For example, is media off limits in the bathroom? Do you want devices out of the bathroom? I do in my home. And I try to make that a place that can be free of devices and connectivity. Now, does that work all the time? Sometimes I lose out on that. But that is a way to sort of designate some rituals and routines. Now, routines are, think about work and play. And in our own lives, we use devices in all these ways. And we can help our kids understand that there's the same kind of routines. So there's routines of using devices for schoolwork, for example, and then to use devices for time when we're playing, which might be playing video games or connecting socially with others. We also can have those routines where we are off of our screens, where we're stepping away from digital media for a time. And that might be, for example, sitting around the table having a meal together. It might be having friends over to play in person. All of those can be the kinds of routines and rituals that help sustain us and that help us build patterns that help us have healthy relationships with technology and with each other. Here's a big one: protect sleep. Protect sleep. Rituals can help us do this. One of the greatest needs of our day, and I would say one of the greatest crises of adolescence in our time, is not getting enough sleep. And our devices, they disrupt our sleep. Research shows this. And keeping devices in our rooms at night, even when they're not right next to our bed, even when they're turned off, then having a device in the room can make our sleep disrupted. So, one of our own rules or routines in our family is that devices, digitally connected devices, stay out of bedrooms at night. So this means, for us, it has meant buying old-fashioned alarm clocks for each of our kids. And they have an alarm clock in the room, and this is how they wake up. And their devices go outside. They can get plugged in overnight, but they can be outside the bedroom. Sleep is something that all of us need, and it's something that, as parents, we can invest in as well for ourselves. Another way we can help with sleep is to utilize the technology available to us. So, for example, if you use Apple devices, there is that nighttime mode where you can turn down the blue light on those devices, and a lot of other brands have similar kinds of opportunities. We also need to consider mental health in the midst of this. And there have been a lot of questions about devices and platforms and social media and our mental health. And it can be true that these environments can raise our anxiety. But here's something that researchers have found recently: that conflict over screens is common in families. And in many cases, that conflict is likely to be more harmful to adolescents' mental health than the screen time itself. The conflict can be more harmful to mental health than the screen time itself. And we may also be closing them off to coping when we close them off from their devices and from their friends. One study found that young people are far more likely to say that using social media makes them feel better rather than worse when they're feeling down. Wow, that's really interesting, isn't it? So, moving to the next big question: how can I supervise what my kids are saying and sharing without making them feel like they're under surveillance? Now, some of us like to surveil our kids, but most of us don't want to be that kind of parent, right? We don't want to be constantly hovering and constantly watching everything. Well, let me give one big piece of advice up front. And that is that the best prevention to most of the things we're worried about with our kids and devices is to talk about it. To talk about it. To take pornography as one example, which is a common concern of many parents, is exposure, right? When it comes to this kind of exposure, studies have found that just talking about it with parents and kids, talking about it in adolescence, leads to less use of pornography in young adulthood. Talk about what your kids might say, see, and find online. Talk to them about what they might say or share or post through devices, what they might be tempted to share with others, what people might ask them for, and talk about your own values and your own sense for the kind of concerns that you have. And this will help your kids to process and also to know that they can talk to you about those things, that they can talk to you about those worries and the things that they experience and the encounters that they have. And this is best when we start at a young age, that they know that if anything they find online makes them uncomfortable, that they can always come to us. Another important piece in this is what I call know the codes, okay? Know the codes. Parents should hold all device passcodes and know the passcodes, the passwords for the platforms that they're on, in particular into mid-adolescence, okay? But, technically, for any kid under 18, we as parents are, we're liable for what they do and say and post in all these spaces. So it's important for us to know those passcodes and to say, I trust you. I'm not going to be logging into your devices all the time, but I need to know as a backup that I have access into those spaces for your protection. For your protection. Along those lines, it's really important to set up a protocol. The question is really not if, but when they'll be exposed to content. Not if, but when they might be solicited by, a stranger in some of these digital spaces. So talk to them about what to do when that happens. I suggest taking a screenshot of what they experience or a screenshot of that, that information or that username, whatever they can of that person who solicited them, but to not respond at all, and then to get out of there and to come tell you. Think about the protocols that might work given the ages of your kids and their online experiences. For those of us who might want to use content filters or content tracking, all of that can be useful for parents, in particular busy parents who we don't feel like we have time to check in and check up and track things on our own. But we need to see all of that as a backup and not our first line of defense. In the foreground should be the conversations. That we cannot substitute talking about these things. We cannot substitute relationship with our kids. But in the backup can be the filters to help support and maybe limit our kids' access. Use what's available to you, in particular, broad services like Google and Apple and even your own internet provider and device providers. They are constantly offering features for families and features to limit. I know on my own devices, I can limit, I can shut off apps for my kids at a particular time of the night. I can limit how many hours a day they're spending on particular platforms. And if that gives you some comfort, if it helps you establish some routines in your family, do that. But talk about your kids with it. Don't just do it in the background because that's surveillance, okay? So supervision is letting them know, hey, we're doing this. This is part of our relationship. This is part of how we set boundaries. And a big piece of that too is to check our own tech habits. I set screen time limits for myself as well. And when I'm trying to get on a platform and it's after a certain time of night, then I'm blocked out. And that's a limit I put on myself to remind myself to get good sleep. One tech reporter said that he put on the lock screen on his phone these 3 phrases: what for, why now, and what else? And I love those 3 questions. What for? Why am I picking this up right now? Why now? Is this a good time? Who am I with? What's the reason that I'm picking up this device? And then what else? What else could I be doing right now? In particular, when I'm choosing this over seeing and being with the people around me. Or maybe I'm even choosing this over a moment of solitude or reflection or prayer. So our own tech habits are shaping our own lives and discipleship and relationships. And we can own that responsibility and not just blame our kids for what we see as bad tech habits. One more piece on that is to consider what you say and share online. Most of us are guilty of sharenting in some way, shape, or form. And it's important to note that, those cute kid photos or even posting our kids' mistakes sometimes online, I've noticed this, particularly with little kids. It might seem cute. It might seem like a way to keep our sanity. Those of us who are at the end of the day are we're tired and we're done, especially parents with younger kids. But I wonder how these posts how our kids might feel about these posts as they get older. I wonder how these posts might follow them into the future. And for those of us, especially with older kids, a recent study found that one of the most common requests of kids ages 10 to 17 was that their parents would stop posting photos without their permission. So in our household, we have a rule. We don't follow it 100% of the time, but our rule is that we ask each other before we post photos. And that has established a sense of trust and a sense of also being able to share a little more freely. Hey, I don't really like it when you share this, or hey, I want you to share about that. So, our last big question: how can I disciple my kids in a digital world? How can I disciple my kids as a follower of Jesus? How does our discipleship tie in with these really practical questions about just how we manage digital media? The questions are really closely related. So I want to suggest 3 different modes that we parent in that are also part of how we are discipling our kids, okay? And the first is architect. So in particular in childhood and in early adolescence, as parents, we are architects. We're helping them build structures that last. And we very much have to remember that we are the parents. Okay, so we can reserve the right to take devices away or turn them off or, disconnect or limit that screen time and access. Even if you've already crossed a line here and allowed what you feel like maybe is too much freedom, be the parent in this space, okay? Be the architect who's setting them up for the future. And consider readiness. Readiness is a really important word. Those who study brain development and pediatric researchers, they've talked about the impact of early childhood tech use and the brain. And sort of their bottom line of these recent studies is that young kids need more human interaction and less screen interaction for what the brain needs to develop, in particular in early childhood. So one researcher said it this way: it's not so much screens are bad, but screens are not such a good idea right now. Akin to driving a car, it's not bad, but driving at age 3 to 5, not such a good idea. Tablets in particular, that we often like to hand those toddlers, they might be so powerful and encompassing that they may not belong in the hands of infants and preschoolers. That's so important for us to keep in mind. Readiness. I'm currently teaching my teenage daughter, my middle one, how to drive. And I think about, we didn't start by just sending her out on the freeway to drive. We started in a parking lot. We started with sitting in a stationary car. And we got comfortable, and then we started moving around the parking lot, and then eventually she got out on small protected side streets, and then eventually on busier roads, and then only at the last step onto the busy highway. It's really important for us to keep in mind letting our kids, for example, sign up for an Instagram account under age 13, which is the legal age at which the user agreement says that they can sign up for that account. Signing them up for that is sort of like sending them out on the highway without first coaching them and walking with them and riding in the car with them. So you can think about that same kind of metaphor and this idea of mentoring, okay? So there's the architect phase and then there's the mentor phase. So in this, we're like that side-by-side driver. And in the mid-teen years in particular, we're taking the opportunity to dialogue about media and its role in our lives. In this phase, you're the guide, you're teaching skills, and you're building character for adulthood. And then finally is the companion phase. The companion phase, where you are the co-traveler. You're using media together, and you're building relationship. Now, you're a companion, of course, all the way through these stages of architect and mentor and companion. But in particular, as our kids get older, as they move into emerging adulthood, they're building different kinds of relationship skills, and our relationship changes. And so our relationship with them about media changes as well. The goal is for them to become mature adults who have a healthy relationship with media and who have a healthy relationship of their own discipleship and their sense for how their faith interacts with who they are in digital spaces, how their faith interacts with what they share in those social spaces, with how they interact with others, with how they're caring for people, with how they might be talking about Jesus, or they might be representing Jesus by the way they act and interact and react, by what they post or choose not to post, by how they respond, and by how they care for other people. And again, the goal is healthy adults who've learned resilience, they've learned self-regulation, they've learned responsibility for themselves, and ultimately that they've learned how to love God and love their neighbor and love themselves in a digital world. Because we're never leaving the digital world. It's here to stay. It's part of our lives. And so if we're going to love God and love our neighbors, if we're going to answer Jesus' call to discipleship, to come follow me, then our everyday yes to Jesus involves walking with Jesus into and through that digital world. That's where we are. That's where we live. That's where our kids live.
As technology increasingly becomes a bigger part of our lives, it's important to establish a theological framework for technology and understand the impact of modern technology. You can revisit the series online at any time by visiting livingtruth.ca. Now, let's sing a song of praise to our God together with our worship team.
My mind to Calvary, where Jesus bled and died for me. I see his wounds, his hands, his feet, my Savior on the cursed tree. His body bound and drenched in tears.